Economic revival continued. You may be wondering, I was talking last time about the establishment of the guilds and the fact that not everybody can be a member of a guild. How did you become a member of a guild? Um, the system is sometimes referred to as the apprenticeship system, even though apprenticeship was only the first stage. Um, you, as a child, if your parents decided that they didn't want you to be a farmer, to work on their farm, or if they didn't have a farm, they would want you to be trained in some other profession. And the easiest way for you to be trained would be for you to grow up in the household of somebody who already followed that profession, not necessarily your parents' profession. And in fact, it was so desirable for a young person to have this experience of living in the household of a craftsman or an artisan that parents often paid for the privilege of giving up their children so that the children could live in the house of the person that they were going to be learning from. This sometimes happened at very young ages. It could happen as early as when you were 7 or 8 years old. So as you were growing up in the house of the man you were apprenticed to, if the guy was a nice person, which he often was, you would end up regarding this person who was teaching you as sort of a second father. And what you would be doing during these years of apprenticeship, you would be helping out with minor tasks. If the guy who was teaching was a blacksmith, you would work with him in the blacksmith shop and stoke the fire and bring buckets of water and things like that, stuff that you didn't necessarily need to know very much in order to be able to do. And meanwhile, the blacksmith was supposed to be teaching you how to be a blacksmith. And if he didn't teach you how to be a blacksmith, your parents could sue in a court of law. And sometimes it happens that a blacksmith or the person who's supposed to be doing the teaching isn't doing his job, and the parents can get their money back. However, at the end of this apprenticeship period, you are supposed to know how to be, for instance, a blacksmith. And then you can go into not business for yourself, but you can become what is known as a journeyman, a day laborer. As I indicate here, that some people think that the word comes from the French word for journée, which is day, and a day laborer is somebody who gets paid by the day. The problem with this definition is it's not always clear that people got paid by the day. Sometimes they got paid by the week or by the month. And so another suggestion as to the origin of the word, which we really don't know, is that a journeyman was somebody who journeyed from place to place, that he never worked in one location, but he would be basically hired help. He wouldn't be an apprentice anymore. He would know what he was doing, but he wouldn't be in business for himself. He would be working for somebody who, for instance, was already a member of a guild. Now, some people spent their whole lives doing this. Some people never became anything more important than a journeyman. But if you were able to get money together, because as I pointed out, it required money in order to start up in business for yourself, either you saved up money or you inherited it, or sometimes what happened is that you would be working for a master and the master would die and you would marry the boss's widow. Now, if the boss's widow was the wife of the man that you'd been apprenticed to, it'd be sort of like marrying your mother, which seems kind of strange, but back in those days, marriage was not always a romantic proposition. So if you were able to get money in one way or another, you had the potential to start your own shop. But you still had to become a member of a guild. Remember, the members of the guild did not want competition. They did not want to have to fight with each other for the attentions of a customer. They wanted everybody in town to have the opportunity to get the kind of goods that the people were providing, but they didn't want so many more providers than customers that it would drive prices down or something like that. So in order to become a member of a guild, first, the guild had to decide that there had to be another blacksmith in town. They didn't have to admit anybody, but you would come and apply to be a member of the guild, and one of the things that you would do would be to produce what was known as a masterpiece. In other words, it would be an example of your work. If you were a blacksmith, it might be some kind of elaborate piece of worked iron. If you were a carpenter, it might be a really beautiful table or chair or something like that. And then you would show this to the guild members, and if they decided that the town needed another carpenter or blacksmith, and if they saw that your work was of an acceptable level, that you would be able to provide customers with what they wanted, then you would be admitted into a guild, and you would have a lot of power. As I pointed out in the last video, you would have political power, you would become wealthy very often. Of course, not all business people become wealthy. You have to have a head for the business. But that would be the way these guilds would be established, not by supply and demand, not by the free market economy that we have today. It was a very controlled situation, and the guilds controlled it. Later on in the 1700s and the 1800s, the guilds will lose power because it's becoming too complicated a situation for them to be able to hold on to their control. So that's the end of my discussion of the economic revival. Now, and you'll notice that the things I've been talking about for the last couple of lectures have been kind of broad, general phenomena. They aren't associated with specific occasions or specific events. But now we're going to go back to the kind of history that involves specific events. And the first place we're going to go is in England. The last time I was talking about England, it was in connection with Alfred the Great. And I suggested that Alfred had basically been the first person to pull all of these smaller regions of England together under a single rule, the rule of Alfred and his descendants. And in the 11th century, you still had the descendants of Alfred the Great in control. In the middle of the 11th century, the King of England was Edward the Confessor. But Edward the Confessor was a very religious man, and it is sometimes suggested that even before he got married, he had decided to submit to a life of celibacy. So Edward had no children, which meant he had no natural heirs to the throne. Who is going to be, and you see he dies in 1066, who is going to be the next King of England? Well, because there is no direct heir, there's a man named Harold Godwinson, who is the brother of Edward's wife. As I point out, this is not really somebody who would normally succeed to the throne, but he is accepted by the English nobility as the new King of England. But not everybody is happy about that. Another claimant to the throne, and actually I used to show the genealogy of all these various families that are involved in it. It's incredibly complicated, but there were a lot of people who had maybe at least as good a claim to the English throne as Harold Godwinson, and one of them was William of Normandy, sometimes known as William the Bastard. Not because he was so mean, but because he was an illegitimate child. Remember, the Normans were the people who started as the Vikings, and then they had come around England and invaded and created mayhem and destruction, and then had eventually settled down in the area that even still today we call Normandy. So he's also often referred to as William of Normandy. William, as you will see, also is related to Edward the Confessor, and also in a not very direct way. Edward's cousin on his mother's side also normally would not have inherited the throne. But he says that Edward the Confessor on his deathbed had stated that he wanted William of Normandy to be the heir to the English throne. Whether he did this or not is really beside the point, because you get the impression that William wanted to invade England, and he would have invaded England no matter what, because William was an ambitious man, and he knew that if he gained control of England, he would become richer and more powerful, which ended up being the case. Now, England was actually being threatened at both ends. Not only did you have William of Normandy thinking about crossing the English Channel and going north into the British Isles, you also had the King of Norway, Harold Sigurdsson, who was interested in invading from the north. Harold Sigurdsson was called sometimes Harold Hardrada, and Hardrada means tough guy, basically. And so Harold was persuaded by some of Edward the Confessor's other relatives to invade England from the north, which he did in September 1066. So Harold Godwinson goes up north to counter this invasion from Norway and fights Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. So you've got Harold Godwinson coming from the south of England and Harold Hardrada coming from the north, from Norway. Harold Godwinson smears the ground with the King of Norway. He has a very decisive victory on September 25th. But, it turned out to be one of those weeks because William, probably knowing that Harold had other things on his mind, decides to invade England from the south. And there's another battle. October 14th, 1066, the Battle of Hastings. This is one of the crucial events in English history. William, in turn, smears the ground with Harold Godwinson. Total defeat. And this and William's subsequent taking over of the British of England is known as the Norman Conquest. And then there's the Norman Invasion, which is the moving over from Normandy to England. Let me emphasize that this did not mean that William switched his base from Normandy to England. William was still in control of Normandy. So William was king on both sides. And in fact, he probably ended up spending more time in Normandy, even after the Battle of Hastings, than he did in England. But William's conquest of England, which gave him the name, besides William the Bastard and William of Normandy, he also became known as William the Conqueror, which is what we refer to him as right now. And all future English kings and queens are descended in some way or another from William the Conqueror. Sometimes it's through the female line, so it wouldn't necessarily be automatically a matter of the descendant becoming the king or queen, but all of the people who did successfully become kings and queens were descended from William the Conqueror. Now, two important things that I want you to remember about this invasion. First, organized over here, England had a fairly simple form of government before William arrived. It wasn't a terribly sophisticated way of governing. William brings over from the European continent the ways of governing that they are using over there. A more sophisticated form of feudalism, for instance. There's more record keeping involved, or at least when historians of early England are looking at this period. Before 1066, the documents are not very thick off the ground. After 1066, there is a lot more to look at, and that's probably because the Normans were not only writing things down, but they were keeping their records, which apparently before 1066, the English didn't do very much. And one of the most important documents that survives today, in fact, we still got it, is called the Domesday Book. Doomsday was not, it sounds like the end of the world, but basically what it meant was that by a certain day in 1086, there was to be completed what was called the Great Survey. William had sent people all over England to get information about land holdings, the amount of taxes that the people who owned that land had to pay under Edward the Confessor how much land they had, so that, if they had a lot of land and hadn't been paying very many taxes under Edward the Confessor, William could up the level, because one of the purposes of this was that William wanted to make sure he was getting all of the tax revenue he could out of the people of England. But today, for us, the Domesday Book has a different purpose. It has a different value for us, because it is one of the most detailed documents, really up until modern times, of the nature of England. How it was divided into territories, who were the big landowners, who were the small landowners. And although there are problems with the Domesday Book, it's not, for instance, a complete record. And some of the things that we would have liked them to write down, they weren't interested in writing down, because they were not making the record in order to serve the purposes of later historians. But the Domesday Book is really one of the most valuable documents that we have in all of English history, not just in terms of medieval history, but in terms of any kind of English history. So that's one of the important things that we can say about William's effect on English history. I'm running out of time, so I'll start another tape. Hold on. See you soon.